Mr. Trump's comments were not confined to Greenland. He also wants to retake control of the Panama Canal and floated the idea of turning Canada into a US state. Darren Reid is an American foreign policy expert at Coventry University. Darren, welcome. Good to see you. Forgive my schoolboy history, but Trump isn't the first US president to express territorial ambitions over Greenland or Panama. US foreign policy does have some form on this, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, US foreign policy has historically been very aggressive. We go back to, for example, the annexation of Hawaii, Texas, for example. The country is built on a lot of expansion into territory that hasn't belonged to it. But this is relatively new in the modern era. We can go back to, for example, 1989 and the US invasion of Panama, which was to support a coup to overthrow the government there. We have lots of other actions in Latin America where US foreign policy has historically been very aggressive. But that part of the world, direct intervention in the Americas, really has died down since the turn of the century, since the start of the 2000s. And to see that return is really, really unique. And this specific interest in Greenland and the aggressive approach that's being taken towards it in terms of the rhetoric that's being used, that is really something that's quite new, I think.
OK, well, let's talk about who's briefing Mr. Trump on this. I mean, is this Elon Musk's influence causing difficulties, given his recent interventions in European politics? And I wonder, once Mr. Trump is in office, whether that will continue.
It's difficult to say where Elon Musk's influence starts and ends. I think Trump has many advisors around him. I think there's a degree of consistency to a lot of the things he's said since he relaunched his campaign, so I'm not entirely surprised to see this. He's certainly taken a very business-focused approach. He's putting a lot of uncertainty out into the marketplace of the world. He's talking about using military force against his own allies, for example. I think this is designed to create uncertainty. I think that's designed to throw potential opponents off balance. I don't think that's necessarily likely to happen. I don't think this is Elon Musk's influence per se. I think Trump has a broad number of advisors around him who've collectively helped him to forge a vision for what his second term is going to look like. And I think a very proactive and very, very aggressive business-like approach to foreign negotiations and foreign policies is at the heart of what Trump is doing. He intends to prove to the world that he is the tough negotiator he has always promised us that he was.
So how much of Mr. Trump's rhetoric is bluster, and how much is this going to be policy? How much of this should be taken seriously?
I think most of it's probably bluster, but do we really want to test the limits of that? I mean, that's the thing when you have a superpower in the world, like China or the United States, for example. If you push the limits, then the consequences for the people who push them could be really quite catastrophic. So it's almost immaterial whether it's bluster or not. The question is does the international community believe it or believe it's a viable threat? I don't for 1 minute think that the military will ever be used to capture or annex Greenland, for example. But, and Trump has said this himself, the issuing of punitive tariffs upon Finland is a much, much more likely scenario. I could potentially see US troops being deployed in Latin America, in Panama. There's always been that sort of power imbalance between the two halves of the continent, and I think US foreign policy, which Trump has clearly been influenced by from the 1980s, from the 1970s, creates a lot of precedent for US military intervention in that region. So it wouldn't surprise me if Trump did deploy troops to the Panama region, but I don't think they would be deployed in Greenland. I think that would be economic pressure. And I think for most of his aims, and he said this himself, the most beautiful word in the dictionary, he said, was tariffs. I think it's going to be the execution of significant tariffs.
Many of Mr. Trump's speeches are intended perhaps for a domestic audience. What should the international community make of this and make of this speech this early?
I think one thing the international community should do is take a step back and look at how the world's changed in the last 10 years. For example, with the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine, that set a precedent that significant powers could, in fact, should break international law and could expand their borders. So while Russia is trying to push in and expand its borders by annexing or taking or invading territory that doesn't belong to it, now the United States is looking to increase its sovereignty. It's very much a tit-for-tat exchange, very reminiscent of certain aspects of the Cold War. the very conflict that people like Putin or Trump grew up in and were normalised into. So what the international community really needs to do is take a step back and say, okay, how has the world changed? Why are significant powers expanding their influence, in fact direct sovereignty over areas? What can be done? Why are they doing this? What can be done to stop it? Why should it be stopped? These are the existential questions I think the international community really needs to start to wrestle with, because the global order is changing. And I think this rhetoric, combined with other things that are happening in the world, is evidence of that.
Darren, good to see you. Thank you for that. Darren Reid, the American
very much.
foreign policy expert at Coventry University.